You are listening to the e-flux podcast.
Hello and welcome to the e-flux podcast. My name is Ben Eastham. I'm the editor-in-chief of Art Agenda, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by the artist, writer and educator Luis Camnitzer. We're here to celebrate the publication by e-flux Journal and Sternberg of One Number is Worth One Word, an anthology of Luis's writings from 1960 to the present day. The book gathers together life's thoughts on the roles of education in redistributing power, the relationship between individual freedom and collective action, and the capacity of art to transform society. So I had the privilege of editing this collection, and now I have the pleasure of welcoming Luis to talk about it. So hello, Luis.
Hi, Ben. How are you?
Very good, thank you. How are you?
Okay. I mean, your introduction was very nice, but I would define myself only as an artist and nothing else. And all the other activities you mentioned, except for art, which you didn't, are media for me to express artistically the way I think as an artist. So I want to clarify that.
I think that's a good place to start then. I mean, so much of this book is really about how art can't be separated from these various different disciplines, and in fact shouldn't be treated as an independent discipline, but as something closer to a meta-discipline that informs the way we are in the world and how we structure reality, I guess. And I guess the book begins chronologically with this text from 1960, and maybe that's a good place to start. It dates from when you were part of a collective of students at the School of Fine Arts in Montevideo, and it's a proposal to reform the curriculum there. So thinking about what you mean, or how you define or don't define art, perhaps you could just explain the context of that reform and the pedagogical model you were proposing with your peers, and the model for art and art education that introduced, in which you return to throughout the book.
Well, at the time, we were very much conditioned by two things. One was the fact that the school was a very academic school. I always refer to it as French Academy, but that's unfair because it really aesthetically, it went to André Lot, a French post-cubist, but also very frozen as a painter and academic in that sense. But in terms of the methodology, it still was based on life drawing, on accuracy and representation, and slowly becoming free of that. And so you were navigating against what you were learning in order to become free instead of learning freedom. And we basically were all anarchists in an ethical way. I always add the word ethical to anarchist, especially today. And so we were concerned with the allocation of power, who had the power, and tried to demolish that. And the other thing was politically, we were all for the independence of Latin America and for coming free from primarily the US, and tried to build a socialist democratic society with side groups that were staunch communist and Maoist and Trotskyite and so on. So in that figure, and in a university where each school had its own ideology, so the law school was communist, architecture was communist and Trotskyite, and so on. In that constellation, the art school was the anarchist fortress. So put that together meant that art was really a tool or even a weapon to change society. And in our terms, at the height of our fight, we believed that we only should be producing art when everybody in society had the possibility of doing so and not before. And that was like our ideological platform. And pedagogically, we were very interested in Bauhaus and then in School of Design of Ulm and of Chicago, Molinage work and Kepesh and MIT and so on, which at that time provided us with an exit from this very narrow path in which we were embarked.
And I think talking about that model and what comes through in that proposal, you objected correctly to this idea that the media in which you work as an artist can be separated from your practice as an artist. And the model you propose is really to invert the model you described, in which you're taught how to technique in a medium, and then afterwards you're allowed to be an artist. And you make an analogy in another piece called Art and Literature between reading and writing and the order in which you're supposed to learn these things. And you say that rather than learning to read and then learning to write, we should learn to write and then to read, which sounds initially kind of absurd almost and counterintuitive, but is quite revealing of this attitude towards learning and education. I wonder if you could just expand on that, what it means to write before you read, or to read the world before you read words.
Well, it's really basically that you learn how to code and then you learn how to decode. And I'm no specialist in alphabetization, but all the time I worked, and obviously from today looking back, you hone your thought. Sometimes you attribute thoughts to the past that you actually project from the present. So I cannot say that I had everything clear in each moment. But what I did have clear was that you should deconstruct the vehicles of authority and analyze when they're useful and when not, and when they serve your purposes, when they serve somebody else's purposes. And then why do they serve somebody else's purposes, and why can't you give primacy to your own purposes, which is really the basis of politics. And politics in that sense are intrinsical part of creation and of the educational process, and not an added on ideology afterwards. And in that, I feel that if you want to communicate with somebody, it's different that somebody else trying to communicate with you. So in that process, you determine the coding system and the need for the other person to understand that coding. And therefore, in the feedback, you iron out how you communicate. And it's a little bit like the process of naming. We all learn about things that are already named, and we don't learn how to name, or we don't even assume that we have the right or power to name, except when we define, okay, this is mine, this is my dog, this is my child, and therefore I have the right to give a name. And with that, we force the object or person that is named to carry that name forever as a form of identity, which is an attributed identity and not a developed one. And all that, I feel, is embedded in the relation of coding and decoding. And if I am forced to organize the world within a given code, I'm subject to a power structure. And I don't have a chance, or I have a very small chance, to affect that power structure. It's always uphill work. I'm not part of the building of that structure unless I really fight for it. So it's not a very constructive relation. And all that makes me feel that if you learn how to read first, you learn how to receive orders and understand them, and you're precluded from giving orders or from understanding what an order is, which I think is very important in social construction.
So we talked, or you mentioned in that respect, the models of the Bauhaus and Ulm and Moholy-Nagy, but perhaps it's worth talking about Paulo Freire here as well, and this idea that education isn't simply about reinforcing an existing language or taking a structure and depositing knowledge in students, but is actually about the practice of freedom and is about giving students or empowering students to create their own languages or to their own realities. And I wonder if you could talk about the influence of his thought on you as a student and throughout your career, really.
There was zero influence, but Freire was post these issues for us. I mean, what I'm talking about is ultimately, starting in 1960, Freire wrote his Pedagogy of Suppressed in 69, I believe.
Yeah.
And one forgets that Freire actually is the same cultural generation that we were. I mean, he was a couple of years older than me. I don't know when he was born, but I'm 37. He might have been 31 or so. So there wasn't that much difference. We were being nourished by the same crisis and developing together and rather in an anonymous way things. That's why I always put together that theology of liberation, Freire's pedagogy, and Latin American conceptualism and Brazilian concrete poetry and other poetry are all manifestations of a common thought that defined our plight, which was totally different to the hegemonic plight. And so some people were more articulate and gave more body to that thought, and Freire was a very important one. But in terms of what we're talking about here, it was after all this. It was maybe closer to Beuys, who also came a decade later to what we were proposing. I mean, the notion of society as a sculpture for us was very clear. It was less ego guided. So we didn't think we were the omnipotent sculptor to shape society. We felt that society was a sculpture that was autopoietic, that was a system that was self-creating, and that we were helping in that process. So ideologically, there was a big difference in all that. Freire fit very much into our picture. And now, I read pretty much everything he did, and it's fantastic. But it's like reading ourselves into that.
Yeah. Perhaps we can talk a little bit about it. It's interesting the way you describe the different ways that a similar current or network of thought manifested through concrete poetry or through Latin American conceptualism or Nicanor Parra, the theology of liberation. And of course, these all feel like different expressions of a shared idea, which is that politics cannot be separated from art, cannot be separated from religion, cannot be separated from anything. And I wonder if you could talk about that idea you mentioned in the book, in which there's a kind of underground network of ideas or thought which pops up in different places, and how that might actually be an analogy for your own work as an artist, working in different media, but having the same underground structuring set of ideas, and how maybe that informed your practice as an artist.
In certain ways, I would say that until the mid-60s, I always was behind myself. Actually, I used that analogy of I felt I was running behind myself and not being able to catch up. I started teaching very early, was in 61 or so. And I clearly, although it was, at the beginning, it was printmaking, which is a very narrow, technically focused culinary medium, I still did it in terms of problem solving. And analyze, okay, what problem are we trying to solve, and how does the medium fit in, enhance, or diminish the problem? And so I would listen to myself talking to the students and think, why I'm not doing that? And I didn't really know how. I was a semi-traditional expressionist at the time, and felt my language had to be a very personal one and express literally what I was feeling, and solve my neurosis and whatever, which was not in line with what I was talking about with my students. And the radical break with that took place in January of 1966, which is when I suddenly felt, well, why is written language separate from drawing or from visual languages? Why is creative literature in one department and creative art in another department? Since the only difference is the media, it's not the problems you're approaching and trying to solve. And if you remove yourself from that, then you are really dealing with knowledge and picking the right medium to handle the knowledge according to the needs of what you're looking for. So that was a crucial step. So for me, it wasn't a stylistic thing that suddenly I was working with language, or I was interested in separating poetry from art language, which was one of the factors in US conceptual art, but rather breaking a limit, and for me, an artificial boundary that I wanted to do away with. So that it was preceded by my notion that, okay, I'm not a printmaker trying to do art. I really should be an artist who uses printmaking whenever that is needed and doesn't when it's not. I should not be looking at the universe through the printmaker tools. I should look at the universe and then draw conclusions or questions that may or may not require a burin and may require possibly even a medium that doesn't exist yet and I have to create for my particular purpose. So that shift from a craftsperson to a creative artist was my first step.
I think this idea of trying to find a medium or trying to find a language or a means of expression and actually having to do that outside of the languages or the media that we are taught, the techniques that we're taught, it reminds me that there's a really nice, there's a section in Rousseau's Emile when he is talking about education, as the whole book is about, and he sees this young girl who doesn't know how to write, but she's keen to learn how to write, and all she does is stitch into a fabric O's. And I think, if I remember in the book, you talk yourself about being taught to write by repeating letters endlessly. But that's as far as she gets, and then she loses interest, or she seems to lose interest, and Rousseau ascribes that to a kind of laziness, that she got as far as writing the O's, but never got as far as putting a sentence together. And that idea is then contradicted by a writer called Anne Boyer, who actually says that maybe that girl wasn't failing to learn a language, but she was creating her own one, and that actually that's a more revolutionary form, that you create your own. Maybe these O's were everything she needed, and that actually that was a way for her to escape the kind of strictures or the constraints of this particular language. And it seems that there's something of that in what you're saying about education, that it's not so much about teaching a form or teaching a structure or teaching a system, but actually about teaching people how to escape it and how to create their own way of understanding reality or their own form. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, that is fair. I think I didn't have it totally pinpointed at the time, but that was the basic approach. And I mean, today I would speak of, helped by Hall, of disarticulating and rearticulating and articulating, and all that mixture would start allowing to deal with things you don't know rather than accept things that are known, which goes back to the naming thing. I think the whole educational process is really to instill you the list of names that exist, which are the basis of information, and to memorize it rather than help you check how do you create a new order, or how do you mix up orders that are enclosed and are presumably hermetic against each other, leak-proof. Where are the leaks, and how can those leaks enrich what you already know and facilitate to go into the future? Basic education deals with the past and only leads with what you might infer from the past towards the future. So you're distorting the future for the benefit of the survival of the past instead of being open to deal with the future, which is the area of the unknown, the area of ignorance. And I think one of the symptoms of that is that the word ignorance is actually a negative, instead of seeing it as a territory to be explored that defines the territory you can explore. And that the unknown is threatening because it doesn't fit what you already know. So risk is minimized and conservatism is reaffirmed. And art is actually the only medium, because it's above those things, that allows you to handle it and to go into this unknown territory, which is so much vaster than the tiny island in which knowledge is confined, and then see, okay, what can you do on that island with what you found out or what you are ambitioning, and what can you not, what's in the way, and why is it in the way, which again makes it a political act as well.
So I think, my understanding of this then is that art is an attitude, and it's inherently revolutionary because it's future oriented. It's about change and dismantlement and then reconstruction. And one of the questions you return to in the book is whether, given that art is about not defying the past but dismantling the past, whether it's possible to teach art and what teaching art might look like. And if it's not too unfair to put that question to you here, do you think the teaching of art is possible? Is it possible to teach an attitude, and what does that process look like?
Well, not only, yeah, I do. It depends how you define art, obviously, but the way I define it, which is to imagine freely and unconstrained by prejudice and media, and being able to formulate problems in the richest way possible. I think that is, I mean, the word teaching is a tainted word anyway, but it can be facilitated, it can be integrated into the whole educational process. And it's not because art is still considered as a post-craft culture, or as a plus in the crafts world, which historically is justified. I mean, there was no art, there were craftspeople, and some of them ventured a little bit further than what the medium or the domination of the medium would allow. And that plus, which couldn't be defined, ended up generating the word art. It's separated from craft. But the baggage of craft is still there, and that's why you're still learning painting 1, painting 2, and so on, instead of learning about how to handle knowledge in a creative way. And handling knowledge in a creative way, I think, is a natural activity, which is not a competitive issue. It's not about who does it better and then maybe land on the walls of a museum or in the space of a museum, but rather makes flexible citizens that constantly maintain a critical distance from which they can improve society. And I like that definition of art better than the one of a producer of objects, of tangible elements, tangible things that can be traded.
I mean, on this idea of fragmentation and I suppose the possible creation of a whole individual who's reconciling their own individual freedom with collective action, you talk in one of the essays about the political artist, and you're suspicious of this term because the political artist seems to exist outside the structures that he or she is critiquing. And I wonder if you could, just with reference to that idea of what it means to be engaged or working with a whole, if you could distinguish between what you just said about the critical or conscious individual against the political artist, so-called, and why that the political artist is an inherently dumb or misleading kind of category.
Well, the problem of the political artist, and I don't exclude myself from this, is that the tendency is to be declarative. The tendency is to express your opinion and hoping that just by stating your opinion, you are changing the minds of others. Instead of understanding that real political art is an act of conversion. You're trying to convert somebody that thinks differently and bring that person to your camp. And in order to do that, you have to create situations in which the opponent realizes that the position is wrong and arrives at your position, not because you tell it or you declare it, but because you set up a situation in which the conclusion, the natural conclusion for the receptor ends up matching what you want. And in that sense, art is manipulation, and it's a manipulation actually that tries to hide the hand of manipulating so that it appears as much as possible to the receptor that decisions are not controlled or guided, but arrived at. Now, all that is basically an educational process. It's not one of appreciation of art in a traditional way. The political artist tries to mix the appearance of appreciative art with a message, and therefore the accent is on content and on narrative content. And by being on narrative content, one way or another, you're actually separating the political act from the creative act. And the point really should be to set up creation in a way that the receptor can create and not just read an opinion, and create in a way that is good for the common good and not just for personal satisfaction. And there is where art, in my term, education, and politics become one in certain ways, become integrated.
Mm-hmm. I was going to say there's this interesting tension there between the educator or the artist creating the conditions under which an individual comes to their own conclusions about an issue, but also manipulating or guiding to a certain extent. And that tension runs right through this book, I think. There's a moment when you go back to the School of Fine Arts in Montevideo 9 years after having left, and 5 or 9 years after your initial reform, and 5 years after having left for New York, and you criticize the school for having stagnated and for not allowing a new generation to come through and to renovate the school and the ideas that are being discussed. And you lead from there. There's this interesting lead into the idea of the revolution within the revolution, and the notion that if this is to be meaningful, it has constantly to be reformed, constantly to be challenged, constantly to be interrogated. So I wonder if you could talk about that where the artist exists in that continuum of not merely leading subjects to a fixed conclusion, but also allowing them the position to disagree and to change, and what that phrase revolution within revolution might mean.
Well, what happened when I went back, actually it was less than 9 years, but it doesn't matter. But when I went back, I found that all the assignments we had developed in the first years of the new curriculum were followed in a very strict way and had become recipes. And the idea originally was that not only that we would teach for 5 years and then leave and use the 5 years to help generate a new generation of teachers, but also that assignments would die very quickly after they generated new assignments, and followed the general idea of the school and not become a new academy, which is what happened. The school became a new academy, and that was a clash. It was particularly harsh in a moment in '69 in which a very creative guerrilla movement was starting to act politically and to mix, Tupamaros, mix creative thinking with militancy and political thinking, and erase the borderlines between both. And the school was oblivious of that breach. And the main issue of contention, actually, which was actually something secondary, was when I said, listen, art history, the way we have been teaching in Uruguay, has to change. And art history now has to include the Tupamaros. And that was a very scandalous statement. And so there was the loss of the full picture of how, as artists, we were supposed to help society shape itself. And instead, going back to a set of recipes that really didn't produce much. And that situation went on for 40 years. At that meeting, which was a big meeting with students and faculty, the first outcome was trying to create a department of art education in which we would only focus on pedagogical issues and generate teachers within the art school as an art project. And the school blocked that and didn't allow it to happen. And after that was 1969, 1970, I broke with the school. I never had contact with the school again until 2 years ago or so, which was a new administration. It was very frustrated students. And we started communicating and revising history and trying now to reconnect with the original thought of the school, not going back, but evolving from 1960, bypassing the separation and working into 2020. But now I'm old and I don't know how much I can do. So, but I still think that by now, for me, it's actually more important to focus on this view of education than focus on production of artworks. That is, the same amount of energy may have a little bit more of impact by working on systems than working on little things.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to hear, such a long period separating these two, to go back to that school now, and I guess to revise what it means to think of a utopian ideal of what an art school can be. Utopia is something that you return to in the book quite regularly. You start in your foreword with a quotation from Thomas More, and you talk frequently about what a utopia is, how the issue is not to deny the existence of utopias, but to recognize that we're all living in someone else's utopia. And this idea, which I think that process describes, of utopia not being a place, but a continuous path constantly being revised. And I wonder if you could just talk about this idea of utopia, what it means to exist in one, or what it means to figure one, and how that relates to this this idea of art as constantly challenging, constantly deconstructing, constantly reimagining the future.
Well, I think my views of utopia evolved a little bit over time. That in the 50s and 60s, it was a fairly solid view of society, and which was our malaise in general, no matter what ideology on the left. Everybody thought of the ideal society as a very fixed structure that was designed by us or by the ideologues we were following. And then slowly it became clear that utopia is perfect, and therefore it's not utopia. If it's perfect, it's stagnant and doesn't work anymore. Then people in my generation, like filmmaker Fernando Biri is the one that articulated it, that utopia was like the horizon that kept moving further and further when you thought you were coming closer. And something that Galeano picked up and is often quoted about. And so utopia became a process. But even more recently, I had a big discussion with my son Gabo, who is interested in the same issues, but is 40 years younger. And he made it clear. I mean, he's anti-utopian because he feels utopia is a construction based on what you know from the past, and therefore it's not sensitive to the future. And that's something I hadn't thought about, and it's a very powerful argument to not to have a vision towards which you want to work, but not to be caught by that vision as a fixed structure, and to constantly be open to feedback. That all these processes are bidirectional. They are coming out from you and coming back to you, and in a constant flux of adjustment and reconsideration and reconstruction. And so utopia is more and more a process and not an ideal.
Mm-hmm. And so there's a horizon, there's this idea of feedback is interesting, or it not being, but I think those two things aren't mutually exclusive. The idea of, I mean, there's a really great Kafka quote where I think he says something like, I think it's in his letters or his diaries, where he says, there is a goal but no way. What we call the way is just wavering. And that idea of working towards something, but also having to accommodate feedback, to think about the future while not thinking about the past, is a kind of, I don't know, it's a utopian way of thinking, but it's a very practical
but the
utopian
temptation,
way of thinking, if those two things can be reconciled.
Of working towards something is to freeze that towards into this ideal edifice that ultimately cannot be changed. And that's where the danger is. And I think that was my mistake in my youth. So it's really focusing more on the path and on where it leads to.
I mean, thinking about utopia, one of the things you mentioned consistently and you've talked about is that we've talked about now is that art is indistinguishable from education, from art education. They're the same thing, that the artist is someone who empowers individuals to become free, to become conscious, to become critical. And the logical conclusion of this, if we can talk about logical conclusions in the context of utopias, is that artists or art educators disappear, that artists disappear, that they're integrated into the society of which they're a part. Is that a kind of utopian vision, in which art as a category or even as a term doesn't exist anymore, when it doesn't have to be taught?
Look, I'm not against the professionalization of artists. I think if somebody wants to be a professional artist, that's fine, and I'm one of them. Mm-hmm. So that's not the point. The point is the exclusion that implies about the non-artists. And that's really what worries me. And there's an usurping of language in which words that mean one thing end up meaning something else. Today, education actually means training. It doesn't mean education. And we have to separate that training is one thing, and it's not a useless thing. It's obviously useful. But what's not good is that it takes over the concept of education instead of staying in the training concept. So universities tend to be training grounds, and schools are training grounds. And those areas that might escape from training, like humanities, are being slowly diminished until they disappear. And then you have art, which is a way of problem solving and problem formulation that is open-ended and is used as a means of production. Somebody asks me, and what do you do? And I'd say, I'm an artist. And, oh, you paint. So immediately, nobody tells me, oh, what problems are you working on? Which would be the normal answer or question for me, and which is more likely to be the one you give to a scientist. Which if somebody says, I'm a scientist, oh, what areas are you researching? Or a philosopher, what areas are you thinking about? So in art, it's immediately a craft that pops in. And then you have STEM, which for me is a big threat for culture and society. Not in terms of the usefulness of applicability, but in the ways of thinking. And suddenly creativity is not anymore dealing with the unknown, but creativity is how do you use ingenuity? That is, how do you mix up things you know in order to get new results? And thinking out of the box, which is attached to creativity, is really what do you find outside of the box to put into the box without even challenging the notion of a box, or who put the box there? What is that box? Those are questions that are art questions, and that by the use of creativity in terms of ingenuity applied to applicability are not being asked. And that is the danger. That is, language is slowly being distorted for the benefits of a certain kind of society, which we would call ultra neoliberal, or whatever the newest term is. I'm not up with the lingo or with the jargon. But there's a danger that slowly, because we learn to read before how to write, we end up internalizing and limiting our ways of thinking.
Well, I think I'm conscious that we're coming to the end of our time. There's a great deal more to talk about, but I can only recommend that our listeners go to the book, which is One Number is Worth One Word, and it's out now. Thanks so much, Luis. That was a real pleasure, and
thanks,
I look forward to
Ben.
speaking again.
Pleasure talking to you. Okay.
Thank you.